guys, so we left off yesterday reading chapters 1 and 2 of Ruby Holler. We learned a little bit about our two main characters, Dallas and Florida, who are twins. They are the oldest in the home, which we'll learn a little bit more about that soon. The Boxton Creek home, which are ran by Mr. and Mrs. Trepid, who are a little bit on the cranky side. We learned a little bit about their personalities. Besides them being cranky, they're very quick to punish with lots of rules, right? And then we learned about Dallas, who is a little more daydreamy and quiet. And then we've got Florida, who's a little sassafras, isn't she? Probably a lot like Miss Vogel, except I'm not quite so negative maybe, but I am kind of sassy. But today we are going to read a couple more chapters. Hopefully you guys enjoyed yesterday's 2 chapters. We're going to start with the chapter 3, which is called Ruby Holler, which also happens to be the title of our book. So let's learn a little bit about Ruby Holler. 20 miles from Boxton was Ruby Holler, a lush, green, hidden valley with only 2 cabins nestled in its depths. The cabin at the far end was inhabited by a man who lived on his own and who kept to himself. Doesn't sound very fun, does it? Although, in the cabin in the middle of the holler lived a 60-year-old man and his wife. One warm morning in June, the man and his wife sat on their front porch swing. "Same old view," grumbled the man. "Same old sagging porch. Same old creaky swing." "Well, you're pretty grouchy this morning," said his wife. "I'm tired of hauling water and chopping wood." "Do you think people are right then?" his wife asked. "Should we move? Get a condo somewhere? Have electricity and heat and that washing machine thing and one of those air conditioning things?" Her husband nodded. "And a television, maybe. And a garage with one of those automatic doors." "Well, that sure would be different." "Yeah, it sure would." A small gray bird swooped down from the sky and landed on the porch railing. It cocked its head at the couple as if it were listening to them. Now, could you guys imagine living with no television? I mean, I know y'all got your phones right now, but could you imagine not having a television or electricity or any of that? That'd be tough, wouldn't it? And they just live in this little holler without any of that stuff, just living life. Pretty interesting, huh? Chapter 4, called Mush. Dallas and Florida sat at their usual places in the far corner of the narrow dining room in the Boxton Creek home. They were not allowed to sit on the long benches with the other children because, well, the Trepids didn't want the other children to learn any bad habits from Florida or Dallas. The Trepids would have preferred Dallas and Florida be meek and cowed, like the others. Florida poked at the mush on her plate. "Do you think there's any real food in this glop?" "Might be. I think I spy a piece of meat stuff." He tentatively stabbed the chunk of meat, imagining that it was steak. The juiciest, best steak in the whole world. "Well, I think it's chopped up cardboard," Florida said, "and ground tree bark with a dash of hog's blood thrown in for color." She caught the eye of the new girl on the end of the long bench and waved at her. "Uh-oh," Dallas said as he spotted Mr. Trepid slipping up behind Florida. "Ow! What you whacking my head for?" "Keep your hands to yourself," Mr. Trepid ordered. Dallas stared at Mr. Trepid's gold tooth. He imagined himself as a dentist, removing that gold tooth, pocketing it, and refitting Mr. Trepid with something else, like maybe something like a red, maybe plastic shaped like a fang. "My hands are to myself," Florida told Mr. Trepid. "Look, see, they're attached to my arm." "Ow! Quit whacking me in the head." "I will quit whacking you on your head when you put your hands in your lap where they're supposed to be," Florida placed her hands in her lap. And when Mr. Trepid moved away, Dallas said, "How are you going to eat with your hands in your lap?" Florida leaned forward and lapped at the mush with her tongue. Mr. Trepid returned in a flash. "My hands are in my lap." "Eat with your fork," Mr. Trepid ordered. "Well, how am I supposed to do that if my hands are in my lap?" Dallas was eyeing his plate, trying not to move a muscle. If he laughed, Mr. Trepid would smack him. The new girl was staring at Florida and Mr. Trepid. "Does he do that to everybody?" she whispered to the boy next to her. The boy looked terrified. With one hand, he covered his mouth, and with the other, he gestured at the rules posted on the wall. The first rule in the dining room was no talking. At 7:30, the buzzer sounded. Dallas washed the last pan and tossed it on the shelf. "To the palace!" Florida raced down the hall. "To the grimy, dark dungeon of the decrepit palace." "Quit that running! Quit that shouting!" Mrs. Trepid yelled. "Get in your rooms!" Down the hall they ran, zipping in and out of other children's rooms. The other children laughed at Dallas and Florida, but quickly closed their doors after they'd passed. Laughing at Dallas and Florida was a serious offense in the eyes of the Trepids. Once inside their rooms, Dallas and Florida each pried up a loose floorboard and deposited their takings from the kitchen. One nearly whole piece of bread and one raw potato each. It was always good to know that there was something under the boards, something to stave off hunger in the night. Later that night, Florida tossed and turned. She dreamed about the Hoppers and then woke up, mad at herself for letting the Hoppers into her dreams and now into her waking thoughts. She and Dallas were 5 years old when they were sent to the Hoppers. For the first few days, they thought they'd landed in heaven. They had their own room, and every day the Hoppers gave them a new toy. But then Mrs. Hopper started getting headaches and kept asking them to be quiet and not to touch things. Dallas and Florida tried to be quiet, but they tried to not touch things. But sometimes they forgot. One day, Florida picked up a $10 bill. It was lying on the kitchen counter. She was studying the picture on it with Mr. Hopper, snatched it from her and slapped her on the arm. "Don't you ever steal from me, you hear?" He looked very mean, way up there glaring down at her. Her insides felt jumbled and queasy. She started noticing little piles of money everywhere. A pile of bills on the kitchen table, a few more on the bookcase, a jar full of quarters. She wasn't ever going to touch their money, ever. One day she came downstairs and saw Dallas sitting on the living room floor with the jar of quarters in front of him. His hand was dipped way inside and he was swirling those quarters around. Mr. Hopper bolted into the room and grabbed that jar, wrenching Dallas's hand out of it. "You little thief," Mr. Hopper had yet said. Florida seized that jar from Mr. Hopper and smashed it on the ground, sending quarters and shards of glass splattering across the floor like hundreds of silver beetles. The next day, Dallas and Florida were back at the Boxton Creek home. Mr. Hopper told the Trepids that he and Mrs. Hopper had made a mistake. They weren't ready for children. If Florida had been older, she might have felt that Mr. Hopper was right and that she was lucky to be away from the Hoppers. But she wasn't older. She was 5. And what she felt was that she and Dallas had been very bad and they would never be in a real family. Now in her room at the Boxton Creek home, Florida wondered why she had dreamed about the Hoppers. They were neither the first nor the last family that Dallas and Florida had been to, and they were certainly not the worst. As she drifted back to sleep, though, she was swallowed by another nightmare about the Hoppers. Next door, Dallas heard Florida whimpering. He crept to the closet and lifted the cardboard flap, covering a hole in the wall. "Florida, what's the matter?" Florida sat up and looked around. She slipped out of bed, tiptoed into her closet, and knelt beside the hole. It was having maggoty nightmare about those Hopper people. Don't think about them. Erase them. Someday we'll get on that freight train and ride out of town, and we'll be on our own, and we won't have to put up with people like that. Someday we'll live in a beautiful place. And on he went like that until Florida calmed down, curled up on the floor of her closet, and fell asleep. Guys, what could you imagine? Could you imagine living that kind of life where you couldn't be silly, you couldn't talk, you couldn't be a kid? I couldn't imagine. I like being a kid, and I'm a lot older. So I want you to put yourself in their position. What would you do in the case that you were in a situation where you didn't get to act like a kid and you were not approved of because you were acting like a kid? And then I want you to think of how you think you would have handled the situation, either the same or differently than Florida and Dallas when they were at the Hoppers. I hope you guys have a great day, and I hope you join me tomorrow for the next couple chapters. Bye, guys.